But turn in your Bible to the opening chapters, Genesis chapter 1. I don't need to give you a page number for that, but you might need a page number for the opening chapter of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1. And I just want to read from verse 26, the creation of men and women. Verse 26, Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and over all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And then if we could just read in the New Testament, and this is probably the one you need to keep open, Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. It'd be great if you could just see that in front of you. I haven't got the church Bible in front of me, so if someone could shout out a page number, that would be helpful.
1134.
1134 if you're reading one of the church Bibles. Romans chapter 8, and I want to read from verse 18. Verse 18 of Romans 8. "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. The creation was subjected to frustration not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently." On the 22nd of May this year, 22 youngsters were killed by a suicide bomber in outside the Manchester Arena at the end of an Ariana Grande concert, and many, many more were injured. On the 19th of September this year in central Mexico, there was an earthquake measuring 7.1 on the Richter scale, and there were many, many aftershocks as well. At least 370 people died, and over 6,000 were injured. On the 22nd of September this year, my mum fell from the top to the bottom of the stairs and broke her neck, and has been hospitalised for 3 weeks and now in a nursing home, and has had a collar on her neck ever since that time, and still trying to mend the break in her neck, which was very dangerous. Last month in California, apparently there was something like 8,000 separate bushfires, wildfires, stoked up by the wind. Not sure whether some of them were deliberately set on fire. At least 41 people have died, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds have lost their homes. Erica Perry was a teacher at Portway Infant School in Allestree, and she started this term in September. After a couple of days was feeling a little bit unwell, so asked for some time off. She died 4 weeks later, victim of a very aggressive cancer. As we sit here in the comfort and security of this church building and our homes this morning, we do so in the knowledge that 1.3 billion people in this world live in extreme poverty. and 22,000 children die each day due to poverty. I can't get my head around that. 22,000 children die each day from the effects of poverty. It's about 15 every minute. At the moment in the world, 65 million people have been forced from their homes. 65 million, it's the highest on record apparently, of which 22 million live as refugees in refugee camps across the world. The Syrian war, which is just about ended now, has been going on for 6 or 7 years. And during that time, over 400,000 Syrians alone have died, despite, as well as all the other people involved in the bloodshed. And since the outbreak of the pandemic in the early 80s, 70 million people worldwide have been infected with the HIV virus. Something like 35 million have died. 35 million. And today, over 30 million in the world are still living with HIV infection. In the UK, there are today over 100,000 people living with the HIV infection, and over the last 30 odd years, 20,000 have died. 20,000 have died in our country. One of them who died on the 24th of August 1991, the 24th of August 1981, was my brother Andrew, who was 35 when he died of age-related illnesses. And on the 14th of October 2014, I went to the neurological department of the Royal Derby Hospital to get some tests done concerning my neurological well-being, my health, why I was shaking so much and why I was becoming so slow, to be told that I got Parkinson's disease. We live in a world, don't we, of chronic, unhealed pain. A world of chronic, unhealed pain. A world infected by enormous, intractable, unalleviated suffering. And we're all affected. We're all affected in some way. Some of us, as I've just mentioned, very personally, like my brother and my mother, and some of you here have already been affected. And I can assure you, if you've not yet been affected, one day you will be. Very personally, you'll be touched by the suffering that is in the world. And it causes us all, doesn't it, to ask the question, this, as we look at the world, whether we're Christians or not, why? It's a big question, and we have to come to terms with it. As I say, whatever our philosophy, whatever our view of life, we have to have some answers. Why does God allow suffering? For many, of course, this issue of suffering in the world is the number one argument against God's existence. It's called the sort of the rock of unbelief. We run a course sometimes in Alistair called Christianity Explored, and on the first week we say to people, if you had one question you could ask God, what would it be? And that is the number one question that always comes up. Why is there so much suffering in the world? It's certainly been something that has been a question for my mother for many, many years, and her fall down the stairs has caused her to say, where is God in the midst of all this? Why me? And so on. There's a lady who comes to the church in Alistair I first met her after her daughter-in-law had died of cancer, but in the same year she'd also lost her daughter. So her daughter had died, and her daughter-in-law had died of cancer in the same year, and she knew she would have, apart from the sadness of that she would end up with no grandchildren. The rock of unbelief. The number one reason to reject a God who is all-loving and all-powerful. If you're a Christian, that's what you believe, that God is all-loving and all-powerful, and non-Christians look at that and say, well, how can that possibly be? It seems logical, doesn't it? If God is all-powerful, can do whatever he wants, and suffering exists, then clearly he's not loving, because he allows it to go on. And if God is all-loving and suffering exists, he's clearly not powerful, because he doesn't do anything about it. So the argument is proved. QED. Or is it? Or is it? You see, if you rule God out of the equation altogether, and say there is no God because there's so much suffering in the world, then you have to answer the question, where does it all come from anyway? And does suffering have any meaning? If it's just survival of the fittest, if the suicide bomber at the Manchester Arena was just dancing to his jeans, as Richard Dawkins would say, then so be it. He was just doing what he wanted to do and he was dancing to his jeans, and suffering is a non-category at that point. We're just animals, bunches of cells who grow and die. But perhaps there is a third option. That God is all-powerful and God is all-loving, and therefore he has powerful and loving reasons for why he allows suffering in the world. What are those reasons? And this is the point at which God must tell us. God must tell us what those reasons are. And I just brought a little illustration. I can't remember, Ben, you might remember whether I did this before in Oakwood many years ago, but I'm going to do it again anyway, and just see if this gives you a bit of an idea as to what I'm talking about. My ball is deflated. Okay, my ball is deflated. Can anybody tell me why my ball is deflated? Have a guess?
Punctured.
Sorry?
It's punctured.
It's punctured. Do you know that?
No.
No, but you're having a guess that my ball is deflated. Any reason else why it might be deflated? Sorry?
You haven't pumped it up.
I haven't pumped it up yet. Do you know that? But it's a good guess though, isn't it? Yeah? Any other reasons why it might be deflated?
It's faulty.
Sorry?
It's faulty.
Yeah, the valve is faulty. There could be all sorts of reasons why my ball is deflated. But it's my ball, and I know the reason. And unless I tell you why, you could go on guessing as much as you want, but you won't know until I tell you. And that's what we need God to do when we come to the subject of suffering. We assume we know better than God, and we look at the suffering in the world, and we make all these guesses, and actually we don't know unless God actually tells us what has gone wrong and reveals it to us. We need revelation. I used to commute in and out of London on the trains from Essex into Liverpool Street many years ago, and I'd get down on the platform for the 7:30 train, and you just come charging down the stairs, and suddenly you'd hear this what we say: the 7:30 train into Liverpool Street has been cancelled, the 7:40 train has been cancelled, and the 7:50 train has been cancelled. The next train into Liverpool Street is 8:20. Oh, and suddenly the crowds of people on the platform become experts on running the railways, and they couldn't run I won't use the slang word, they couldn't run a party in a brewery, and if I was one of them, I'd do this and I'd do that. But we didn't know that there'd been a fire in the depot and they couldn't get any of the trains out. It wasn't their fault, there'd been an explosion or whatever. We needed to be told, and that is one of the things that people always complain about. If only they told us what's going on. Isn't that what you hear people say at airports? If only there's some communication. Well, God has communicated with us. And we live in a world that has gone wrong. We live in a world that isn't how it was meant to be. And I read those few verses about creation, but I just want you to think about the beginning of time and think about the world as God intended it. And there were at least four perfect relationships at the beginning of time. So God created men and women so that he could have a relationship with us. That's why he did it. He didn't have to, but he wanted to create a world of people who could have a relationship with him, so the world was a spiritually perfect place. People walked with God. Or put it the other way around, we're told that God walked in the garden with people. People had a perfect relation spiritually with God. There was friendship. And interestingly enough, people had a perfect relationship, if I can say it, psychologically with themselves. People knew who they were. They knew what they were doing on the planet. They knew what their purpose was, what their identity was. I sometimes say to the young people I talk to in school that the two big questions you've got to get to grips with in life is, who are you? What does it mean to be a human being? And what are you doing here? And there's 7 billion of us scurrying around the planet. Who are you? And what are you doing here? Well, people knew that. It wasn't an issue. There was no trauma over who they were and what they were doing here. It was a perfect world psychologically. And it was a perfect world socially as well, in terms of relationship with each other. There was peace, there was harmony, there was friendship. In fact, the Bible describes a man and a woman who were naked and not ashamed, and God sees all this and says, this is very good. I like this. This is just how it was intended to be. And it was a perfect world environmentally as well, as far as we can tell. There was no issues with the environment breaking up or problems with the environment. It was a wonderful world. It was a paradise environment. So whether it was spiritually, psychologically, socially, or environmentally, it was a wonderful world. It's the one we long for. And suffering is basically the experience that one of these relationships has gone badly wrong. We didn't read it, but in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis you get this description of men and women turning away from God, turning their backs on God, if you like, sticking two fingers up at God and saying, we don't want you to run the world for us, we'll run the world ourselves. We want to make up the rules. I know it's an old song, but apparently the most popular funeral song these days is Frank Sinatra's I Did It My Way. Isn't that amazing? And God would not allow that. He would not. I mean, the one thing that he would not do would let human beings make up the rules without him. That was the one thing that he would not give to them to do. He gave them a responsibility to rule the world, to represent him, to reflect him, to be his image bearers. That's what we were meant to be. But he wouldn't let us run the world without him. And so his just judgment came into the world, his punishment upon men and women, the curse as we call it. And those four relationships were all affected. This is how the world is described today. That when we're born into the world, we don't have a relationship with God, we're cut off from God, we're spiritually dead, the Bible says. There is a gap between us now, we're spiritually cut off. The wages of sin is death. I mean, one of the key issues of suffering for all of us is growing old and one day dying. The question, of course, is why do you die? And God had said, in the day you disobey me, and you eat the fruit of that tree, you will actually die. We're spiritually cut off from God. And psychologically, at that point, suddenly the thing that's introduced into the world is fear. Adam, where are you? I heard your voice calling me in the midst of the garden, and I hid myself because I was afraid. And from our psychological insecurities comes many, many of the suffering things that we see in the world today, from depression to eating disorders to psychological breakdown to suicide and so on. I was reading just last night before I fell asleep a report that's just been published, or a statistic that's just been published. The increase in the incidence of young people self-harming has grown 70% in the last 5 years. Young people growing up in this broken world, and the incidence of self-harm has increased by 70%. It's mainly with young women. A doctor in the church in Alistair told me the other day that every day, at least 3 young women present in A&E in Nottingham at the QMC, having tried to take their own lives. 1 hospital, 1 accident and emergency department, 3 every day at least. Spiritually broken, psychologically broken, and socially, we're broken. The other statistic I just read yesterday, I reckon it's now £50 billion a year. It costs our society, your taxes, £50 billion a year, just to deal with the effects of family breakdown. That's the effects of this rebellion, this turning our backs on God. We fight, we blame, we murder, social problems, even just the breakdown in normal friendships and warfare. And the final relationship, environmentally, creation is hostile. We get floods, we get earthquakes, we get fires, we get drought, global warming and so on. And what I'm trying to say is, I know this is big picture stuff and there's going to be some questions afterwards that you'll have, and I'll be happy to stay around and we can talk about some of those, but what I'm trying to say is that all suffering in this broken world is directly or indirectly due to men and women, people like us, saying, God, we don't want you to rule the world, we want to rule it ourselves. That is the ultimate origin of all suffering and evil in the world. Suffering reminds us that we've turned our backs on God. And it's important to say that, as I said then, that it's a question of all suffering is directly or indirectly. If you happen to be in an earthquake zone when an earthquake happens, that's not a direct result of suffering. You're suffering indirectly because you weren't responsible for the earthquake. But in the case of my brother, who was a practicing homosexual, he went to America in the early 80s and caught the HIV virus and died of AIDS. And that was a direct result of his particular lifestyle. It's a bit like, if I can put it like this, if this helps you, it's a bit like a diner streamer. I'm not a mountaineer, I'm not a caver, but apparently you get these people who go into caves and they find underground streams. And they can't follow them because they go deep under the ground, and so they chuck loads of dye into the underground streams and say, right, we'll see where this dye suddenly appears. And so they then leave the caves, get into helicopters, and a week later they fly for miles. And suddenly in a river, sort of maybe 100 miles away from the caves, they find the dye appearing. That's where that river's gone. That's where it was, and they track it. It's as if right at the beginning of history, this dye, this evil dye, was introduced into the world in which we live, and it comes out like this, all round. And so the finger is not pointing at God. You see, people look at suffering and they point to God and say, this is all your fault. When actually the finger is pointing at us and saying, it's our fault. But, and it's a big but, this is not the end of the story. It's not how the world will end. God hasn't left the world to go this way. We live in a world that is on the mend. And that's what Christianity is about. And it's interesting that if you look at all the religions of the world, it's only Christianity that has a story that actually, a truth that actually answers all these issues that we've been looking at. We're not condemned forever. God could have ended it all, but he's got a better plan. And I don't know if this helps you, can we do a bit of Shakespeare on Sunday mornings, Aaron? Is that all right? Yeah, always, right. You know Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question. He's basically a messed up guy, psychologically, his father's been killed, he thinks it's his uncle who's done it, so his uncle can have his mum, and should he just feels inert, he can't get himself to actually get up and raise arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing them and kill, his uncle, but he just feels so weak and hopeless, and should he just kill himself and get rid of his pain, to be or not to be? And you think, Hamlet, if only you could have an argument with the author who made you like this, Shakespeare, that would be great, wouldn't it? You could say, why have you made me like... That's what he's saying, basically. Why have you made me like this? But he can have an argument with Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's the author and Hamlet's just the character in the play. The only way that he could have some relationship with the author is if Shakespeare wrote himself into the script of the play. And then he could go to him and say, come on, Shakespeare, why am I like this, to be or not to be? But he can't do it. But we live in a world where the author has written himself into the script. Yeah? You got it? This is just absolutely magnificent. We live in a world where the author, the creator, has written himself into the script of history so that we can relate to him and know that there is an answer. And it's just great that you're beginning to think about Christmas already, because get this, guys, this is the big time when you can talk to people about God coming into the world to sort out the mess that everybody experiences. Lo, within a manger lies he who built the starry skies. That's just an incredible thing to say. But the feeding trough is the creator of the world. Got it? That's what we're talking about at Christmas, isn't it? He came down to earth from heaven, who is God and Lord of all. He came down to us. God comes and identifies with this suffering world. He's involved. He feels the pain, and he feels your pain, and he feels my pain. He rolls his sleeves up, and he's subjected to ridicule and rejection and torture and death. So there's no experience, we're told in the Bible, that he hasn't experienced on our behalf. I have a friend who is retired now, but he was a surgeon in Sheffield. He wasn't on duty the day of the Hillsborough disaster 26 years ago, but when he heard what was happening on the telly, he came straight into the Royal Hallamshire in Sheffield, the hospital where he worked, and he spent the late afternoon and the early evening talking to parents about their kids who were on machines just keeping them alive, but who were actually brain dead, and the machines needed turning off. And as a Christian, he tried to comfort these people, and he said to one father, look, God knows what you're going through, and he can support you at this time. And this father turned to my friend Bill and got him by the lapels of his suit and started to shake him and said, "What does God know about losing a son?" And then realised what he said. That even in that moment of the utmost pain and sadness, God knew exactly what he was going through. Let me read this to you. I know some of you will have heard it before, but it's probably very appropriate at this time for those of you who haven't heard it. It's called The Long Silence. At the end of time, billions of people were seated on a great plain before God's throne. Most shrank back from the brilliant light before them, but some groups near the front talked heatedly, not cringing with cringing shame, but with belligerence. "Can God judge us? How can he know about suffering?" snapped a pert young brunette. She ripped open a sleeve to reveal a tattooed number from a Nazi concentration camp. "We endured terror, beatings, torture, death." In another group, a Negro boy lowered his collar. "What about this?" he demanded, showing an ugly rope burn. "Lynched for no crime but being black." In another crowd, there was a pregnant schoolgirl with sullen eyes. "Why should I suffer?" she murmured. "It wasn't my fault." Far out across the plain were hundreds of such groups. Each had a complaint against God for the evil and suffering he had permitted in his world. How lucky God was to live in heaven, where all was sweetness and light, where there was no weeping or fear, no hunger or hatred. What did not God know of all that man had been forced to endure in this world? For God leads a pretty sheltered life, they said. So each of these groups sent forth their leader, chosen because he had suffered the most. A Jew, a Negro, a person from Hiroshima, a horribly deformed arthritic, a thalidomide child. In the centre of the plain, they consulted with each other. At last they were ready to present their case. It was rather clever. Before God could be qualified to be their judge, he must endure what they had endured. Their decision was that God should be sentenced to live on earth as a man. Let him be born a Jew. Let the legitimacy of his birth be doubted. Give him a work so difficult that even his family will think him out of his mind. Let him be betrayed by his closest friends. Let him face false charges, be tried by a prejudiced jury and convicted by a cowardly judge. Let him be tortured. At the last, let him see what it means to be terribly alone. Then let him die so there can be no doubt he died. Let there be a great host of witnesses to verify it. As each leader announced his portion of the sentence, loud murmurs of approval went up from the throng of people assembled. When the last had finished pronouncing the sentence, there was a long silence. No one uttered a word. No one moved. For suddenly, everyone knew that God had already served his sentence. You see, in Christianity, and Christianity alone, God has wounds. God has scars. He feels our pain. He knows what we go through. Could you relate to a God like that? But it isn't just that he identifies with us and rolls his sleeves up. Finally, we can say that he doesn't just identify with us, but he dies so that we don't suffer forever. Which is why Paul says the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that's going to be revealed to us. He undoes the effects of our rebellion and begins a new creation. And that's what this is about this morning. That's what church is about. It's the new creation. So spiritually, when you are a Christian, when you become a Christian and God puts his Holy Spirit within you, you are born into a spiritual relationship again where you can relate to God. Yeah, we were born originally to relate to God. We were made originally to relate to God. We lost that, but now we can relate to God. That's fantastic. I was talking to God this morning. I was talking to the creator of the universe this morning. I was talking to him about you guys. It's a staggering privilege, isn't it? To know that we're in a relationship with the God who made the universe and made me and knows everything about me. That is what Christianity is. Like Jesus said, you must be born again. But not just spiritually does he put us back together, but psychologically. Now that's a big issue to discuss, but ultimately there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. He gives us his peace. because he brings us his forgiveness. We don't have to go around the world feeling we're guilty or we've messed up, as we were hearing yesterday at the men's convention. There's a lovely phrase in one of the letters in the New Testament that as Jesus is, so are we in this world. As Jesus is now, so are we now. But we're in this world. Is Jesus perfect? What are you? It's hard to say, isn't it? Because you don't believe it, and we find it hard to believe we're perfect. Is he accepted before the Father? What are you? Accepted. Is he greatly loved so that he can never be separated from his Father? Yes, you're greatly loved. As he is, so also are we. But we're in this world. Psychologically, people who are Christians do a lot better than people who aren't Christians, statistically. But socially, he mends relationships. The church is God's new society. You guys would never get together, humanly speaking, would you? I mean, there's a guy who plays rock, you know. There's Rolls-Royce engineers. There's nurses and doctors and, I don't know, teachers. You just wouldn't get together, would you? But that's what the church is about. It's God's new society. It's people from every walk of life, every colour, every nation, every tribe, every people, every tongue. One of the most moving things for me, you think of the Arab and the Jew and the intractable suffering of Palestine over the years. And I saw an Arab and a Jew on the stage back in 2010 when I was at a conference, hugging each other. An Arab and a Jew hugging each other and saying, Jesus Christ is the only hope for the world because he saved us both and we're brothers together. So he puts us back spiritually, he puts us back psychologically, he puts us back socially, and ultimately one day he will put us back environmentally, as this passage says. The creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. We live in a world that's in bondage to decay, but it will be liberated and brought into the freedom of the children of God. And we too are waiting the redemption of our bodies, so we'll have no more Parkinson's, no more bad knees, no more cancer, no more whatever it is you struggle with physically. We will be made completely new. Until you get to the end of the Bible and you see the new heavens and the new earth. Now, do you see how it's only Christianity? I've taken you from the beginning to the end of the Bible. It's only Christianity that has the answer to this intractable problem of unalleviated pain and suffering in our world. I haven't answered all the questions, but the world is broken. It's caused by our rejection of God. But suffering itself points us to Jesus. It points us to a God who has suffered, identified with the world, and then he's died in our place. When my brother was suffering with the effects of AIDS, I was working for a Christian organisation, and the boss came in one day and he said, you know, this AIDS thing that's blown up, he said, it's massive, we need to have something to say on it. Is there anybody who's prepared to read a few books on the subject and recommend one book we can give to all our staff? And he didn't know what I was going through at the time, but I said, yeah, I'll read the book. So I took about 5 books home on the subject at that time. And I was struck by a man called Steve Arterburn, that some of you may have read some of his books, but he was dying of AIDS at the time. And he said this, as a Christian dying of AIDS: I'd rather live one day as I am now than for eternity as I was then. I'd rather live one day as I am now than for eternity as I was then. And I don't know how you've come to this morning. You may be someone who's not yet a Christian, who's thinking about these things, and you've got questions about suffering. And it may be that there's just been something that's been said this morning that just makes a bit of sense to you, or it may have raised more questions for you. But do you see that here is the answer to the world's problems, in Jesus Christ alone, the one who died for you? It may be that you're a Christian who is suffering. And that raises lots of questions as well, doesn't it? Why doesn't God just heal us? But we're not shielded from the pain and hurt of the broken world. Right the way through the Bible, you will see people who suffer, who are godly. It's just not right that those who, I mean, when I got Parkinson's, the number of people who said to me, why you, such a good person like you? I said, just slap them around the face and say, shut up, why shouldn't I? I'm part of this fallen world. We're not immune. But it may be that you're a Christian who hasn't suffered much at the moment, but you know people who are, and you've got a message for them. There is hope. There is a future. The sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us. And one of my spiritual heroes at the moment is a guy called John Piper. And he has this phrase which I just think is brilliant. He says, 1 nanosecond of glory will extinguish a lifetime of suffering. Isn't that good? Joni Erickson Tada, you know, the girl who, paraplegic, who had a diving accident at the age 18, she's now 65, 70. 1 nanosecond of glory will extinguish a lifetime of suffering. That's the hope that we have. So do be thinking about your response to this morning, whether you need to bring a message of hope to the world, whether you need to relate to God properly, whatever it is, respond to it. Let me pray.